The historical record is not a single, coherent document, but a vast and fractured mosaic of whispers, omissions, and outright fabrications. Within its shadowed corners, there exist case files so profoundly unsettling that they are sealed away, not for lack of evidence, but for an overabundance of it. They speak of truths too terrible for public memory. This is one such file. It concerns a woman named Mercy Hollow, once designated as property, and the 2 children of her master, who the world was told had simply vanished into the woods. The truth, however, was far closer to home, buried deep beneath the floorboards of a decaying house, waiting for the right questions to be asked. If the quiet horrors of the past are what you seek, and this is the first time you have found our archive, then subscribe to our work. Ensure you do not miss the turning of the next page. The year was 1870, a full 5 years after the cannons had fallen silent, yet the air in the remote arteries of the American South still hung thick with the ghosts of conflict. It was a time of accounting, of drawing new lines on maps and old lines in society, a period when the victorious Union sought to quantify its newly reunified nation through the cold, impartial arithmetic of the census. For the men tasked with this monumental effort, it was a journey into a wounded land, a landscape of scorched earth and even more scorched souls. One such man, a Union census officer, found his duty carrying him ever deeper into the suffocating embrace of the New Jersey Pine Barrens. He was a man of ledgers and verifiable facts, a former quartermaster who found a strange comfort in the neat columns and predictable sums of his new profession. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he had witnessed, a way to impose a fragile order upon a world that had so recently torn itself asunder. He had been given a list of properties, many of which had not been officially documented since before the war, forgotten homesteads and isolated farms that dotted the vast, ominous wilderness. His journey that autumn was one of increasing isolation. The well-trodden roads of civilization gave way to winding, sandy tracks that seemed to lead nowhere, flanked on all sides by an impenetrable wall of pitch pine and gnarled oak. The sunlight, so bright and clear just miles before, was now filtered through a dense canopy, dappling the forest floor in a shifting, disorienting pattern of light and shadow. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a silence so profound it felt like a presence, broken only by the rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth or the mournful cry of a distant bird. For 3 days he traveled, his horse growing skittish, his own meticulously ordered mind beginning to fray at the edges. The Barrens had a reputation, a place of local legends and whispered warnings, a wilderness that did not suffer fools and was said to swallow the unwary whole. The officer, a man from the stone cities of the north, dismissed such tales as the superstitious ramblings of an uneducated populace. Yet, he could not deny the oppressive weight of the place, the feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes from the depths of the woods. On the morning of the 4th day, guided by a crumbling, hand-drawn map provided by the county clerk, he located his final destination, the Bellwether property. It was not so much a discovery as a slow, creeping realization. The forest did not end where the property began. Rather, the property itself seemed to be in the final stages of being consumed by the forest. What must have once been a proud, cleared plantation was now a ruin in slow motion. The fields were overgrown with thorny brambles and invasive vines, the fences long since collapsed into mounds of rotting wood. At the center of this desolation stood the farmhouse, a 2-story structure that might have once been handsome, but was now a skeletal wreck, a monument to decay. Its white paint had peeled away in long, leprous strips, revealing the dark, weathered wood beneath. Moss grew in thick, velvety patches across the roof, and a shutter hung from a single hinge, banging a soft, rhythmic dirge against the siding in the faint breeze. The windows were dark, vacant voids, like the eye sockets of a skull, reflecting the impassive pines that crowded in on all sides, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to scrape against the walls. The air was stagnant, thick with the smell of wet rot and something else, something vaguely sweet and deeply unpleasant that clung to the back of his throat. The officer dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft, mulch-like ground. The silence here was different, heavier. It was the silence of a place that had been abandoned by life, yet was not entirely empty. He approached the porch, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, threatening to give way. He raised his hand to knock on the heavy oak door, its surface blistered and warped by decades of sun and rain, and for a moment he hesitated. Every instinct, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 4 years of brutal warfare, screamed at him to turn back, to mount his horse and ride away, to mark the property as derelict and its inhabitants as deceased in his ledger. It was a place of profound sorrow, a place where something had gone terribly wrong and the very soil seemed to retain the memory of it. But he was a man of duty, and his instructions were clear. He was to account for every soul, living or dead. He knocked, the sound echoing flatly in the oppressive quiet. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, the sound seeming to be swallowed by the house itself. He was about to turn away, to make a note in his logbook, when he heard a faint sound from within, the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair on a wooden floor. A moment later, the door creaked open, not all the way, but just enough for him to see the woman standing in the shadowed interior. She was a black woman, perhaps in her 50s, though the deep lines etched into her face made it difficult to be certain. She was tall and gaunt, her frame draped in a simple, faded dress the color of dust. Her hands, long and thin, were clasped before her, perfectly still, but it was her eyes that held the officer's attention. They were dark and deep-set, and they regarded him not with fear or surprise, but with a kind of weary resignation, as if she had been expecting him, or someone like him, for a very long time. There was no light in the house behind her, only a profound and impenetrable darkness that seemed to have a physical weight to it. The officer cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like an intruder, a trespasser on some ancient grief. He introduced himself, stating his purpose with a formality that felt absurd in this setting. He was an officer of the United States Census Bureau, he explained, here to document the inhabitants and the state of the Bellwether property. The woman listened without expression, her gaze unwavering. When he had finished, she remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the sighing of the wind through the pines. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, a voice that sounded unused, rusted with disuse. She gave her name as Mercy Hollow. She said she was the only one left. The masters, Thomas and Evelyn Bellwether, she explained, had passed away. The father had died of a fever 2 winters prior, and the mother had followed him just a few months later. Her heart, Mercy said, having given out from grief. The officer made a note of this in his ledger. 2 deceased. He then asked the requisite question. The one his duty demanded he ask. He inquired about any other family members, specifically about children. He had seen the records in the county seat, old tax documents from before the war that listed 2 children, a boy and a girl, William and Clara Bellwether. For the first time, a flicker of something disturbed the placid surface of the woman's composure. Her stillness was broken by a subtle tremor in her clasped hands. Her eyes, for just a second, darted away from his, toward the dark tree line that pressed in on the decaying house. She told him the children were gone. The officer, accustomed to the vagaries of post-war life, asked for clarification. Had they been sent to live with relatives? Had they succumbed to illness? Mercy Hollow looked back at him, her expression once again unreadable, a mask of quiet sorrow. She said the woods had taken them. She spoke the words as if they were a simple, irrefutable fact, a piece of common knowledge that required no further explanation. She recounted the story in that same flat, emotionless tone, a story that was apparently the accepted truth of the matter. One afternoon, years ago, shortly after the war had ended, the children had wandered into the pines to play, as they often did, but on that day, they did not return. The father had organized search parties. Men from neighboring farms had combed the woods for weeks, calling their names until their throats were raw, but they found nothing. No tracks, no shred of torn clothing, not a single sign. It was as if the forest had simply opened up and swallowed them. The parents, she explained, had died believing their children were still out there somewhere, lost in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They had died believing the woods had never given them back. The officer stood on the porch, the pen poised over his ledger. He was a man of logic, of cause and effect. Children did not simply vanish without a trace. There were always signs, clues, a trail to be followed. The story felt wrong, incomplete. It felt like a narrative crafted to conceal a different, more terrible truth. He looked at Mercy Hollow, at her placid face, and the deep, old pain in her eyes. He looked past her into the suffocating darkness of the house, and he felt a cold certainty that the answer to the children's disappearance was not in the sprawling, indifferent forest, but within the rotting walls of this very house. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched from the trees like grasping arms. The air was growing cold. He made a decision. It was a departure from his usual protocol, a deviation from the efficient, detached methodology he preferred. He told Mercy Hollow that it was too late for him to begin the journey back, that he would need to stay the night. He would take measurements of the property in the morning to complete his official survey. It was a plausible lie, a professional excuse that masked a deeper, more personal compulsion. He could not leave. Not yet. He had a sudden, inexplicable feeling that he had stumbled upon one of those fractured pieces of the mosaic, a story that had been deliberately left out of the official record. He sensed that something was buried here, both literally and figuratively, and his methodical mind, the part of him that craved order and resolution, could not turn away from the mystery. Mercy Hollow showed no surprise at his request. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate inclination of her head, and stepped back, opening the door wider. She invited him into the darkness, into the heart of the house and its silence. As he crossed the threshold, leaving the last of the dying light behind, the officer felt a profound sense of stepping out of the known world and into a place governed by older, darker rules. His official duty had ended, and a personal obsession, one that would come to haunt him, was just beginning. He was no longer just a census taker. He was an investigator, and his first piece of evidence was the unshakable feeling that Mercy's version of events was a carefully constructed lie. The interior of the Bellwether house was a tomb sealed against the passage of time. As the heavy door closed behind the officer, it shut out not only the dying light of the autumn evening, but the entire 19th century, plunging him into an atmosphere that felt decades older, preserved in a state of arrested decay. The air was the first thing he noticed. It was thick and motionless, heavy with the layered sense of dust, dry rot, and the faint, almost imperceptible sweetness of long-dead flowers. It was the air of a room that had been hermetically sealed, where memories had been left to fester and decompose alongside the physical objects they clung to. Mercy Hollow moved through the oppressive darkness with a familiar, gliding motion, her bare feet making no sound on the wide plank floors. She lit a single oil lamp, and the sudden bloom of pale, yellow light did not so much illuminate the space as it did animate the shadows, making them writhe and retreat into the corners like disturbed creatures. The room the light revealed was a grand parlor, or what was left of one. Every piece of furniture, the elegant lines of horsehair sofas and carved mahogany tables, was draped in a ghostly shroud of white linen. The sheets, thick with the dust of years, followed the contours of the objects beneath, creating a landscape of pale, silent forms that resembled a collection of funerary monuments. Dust motes, disturbed by their entry, danced in the lamplight like a frantic constellation of tiny spirits. On the walls, dark rectangular patches showed where paintings had once hung, but a few remained. They were family portraits, their subjects rendered in the severe, formal style of a previous generation. The lacquered eyes of forgotten bellwether ancestors stared down from the gloom, their expressions a uniform mask of haughty pride and cold judgment. Their gazes seemed to follow the officer as he moved, and he felt a palpable sense of being weighed and measured by the dead. The silence of the house was not empty. It was filled with the echoing quiet of lives lived and ended within these walls, a quiet so profound that the officer could hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of his own pocket watch, a sound that felt like a profane intrusion. Mercy motioned for him to sit at a small, uncovered table, its surface a grimy map of overlapping cup rings and settled dust. She placed the lamp in its center, creating an intimate circle of light in the vast, spectral darkness. She did not sit herself, but stood just at the edge of the light, half in shadow, a silent sentinel in her own forgotten world. The officer, feeling the need to fill the suffocating silence, began his official inquiries, asking about the property's acreage, its livestock, its yield before the war. He was attempting to reassert the familiar logic of his profession, to impose the order of his ledger upon the palpable chaos of memory that saturated the house. Mercy answered his questions in her low, even voice, providing facts and figures with a surprising clarity. She spoke of a time when the Bellwether plantation had been prosperous, a small but significant kingdom carved out of the wilderness, built on the backs of a dozen enslaved people. As she spoke, the officer found his attention drawn to the story behind the numbers. He was a student of human nature, and he could see that this house, this woman, were a case file of a different sort. He gently steered the conversation away from agriculture and toward the family itself, toward the master and mistress whose portraits were likely hidden beneath those white shrouds. He asked what they were like. For a long time, Mercy was silent, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the lamp. The officer thought she would not answer. But then, she began to speak, and the story of the Bellwether family unfolded not as a simple recollection, but as a kind of confession, a slow, painful exhumation of a past that had been deliberately buried. Her account began before the war, in the final, gilded years of the Old South, a time, she said, when the family's cruelty was disguised as refinement. The mother, Evelyn Bellwether, was a woman consumed by a pathology of pride. Her obsession with her lineage, which she could trace back to the earliest English settlers, was the central organizing principle of her existence. She moved through her own home as if it were a museum dedicated to her ancestors, her touch light and infrequent, her hands almost always concealed within fine leather gloves. Mercy explained that the mistress rarely raised her voice. Her cruelty was not a thing of heat and passion, but of a chilling, surgical precision. It was a campaign of small, daily torments, of psychological dismantlings that left no visible scars. A servant who misplaced a piece of silver would not be whipped, but would be forced to stand in silence for an entire day, holding the offending object, while the mistress spoke of the moral failings and inherent inferiority that led to such carelessness. She had a way of speaking that could strip a person of their humanity, reducing them to a flawed object in her perfectly curated world. The father, Thomas Bellwether, was a man of a different, more volatile substance. Where his wife's cruelty was psychological, his was brutally physical. He was a man of profound and terrifying rages, a man who governed his small empire through the systematic application of fear. Mercy described the unnatural quiet that would descend upon the entire plantation when the sound of his horse's hooves was heard approaching. He was a large man, with a voice that could curdle milk and hands that were thick and calloused. His brutality, however, was not random. It was a tool he used to maintain a fragile sense of control over a world he felt was slipping from his grasp. He was a man haunted by the specter of his own diminishing importance, and he took out his rage on the only people he could, the bodies he legally owned. Mercy spoke of him with a detached, almost forensic calm, as if recounting the behavior of a particularly vicious animal. Yet, beneath the calm, the officer could sense a deep, abiding terror, the memory of which had been worn smooth with time but never erased. Into this household of cold pride and hot rage, 2 children were born, William, the elder, and Clara, who was 2 years his junior. From Mercy's telling, it became clear that the children were not so much raised as they were curated, treated as the next acquisitions in the Bellwether collection, the living proof of the continuation of a proud and unblemished line. The mother saw them as vessels for her ancestral legacy, dressing them in immaculate, restrictive clothing, and drilling them in the tedious genealogies of their forebears. The father saw them as extensions of his own will, expecting a rigid obedience that was unnatural for any child. There was, Mercy's account implied, little room for affection in this arrangement. Love was a messy, unpredictable emotion, and the Bellwether household was a place of rigid order. It was in this emotional vacuum that the children's strange fascination with Mercy Hollow began. Mercy had been assigned to them as a caretaker, a duty she performed because she had no choice. But for William and Clara, she became something more. She was the only source of warmth in a house of cold surfaces. The officer could picture it as she spoke. 2 small, pale children, escaping the sterile formality of the parlor to seek refuge in the steamy, fragrant chaos of the kitchen, Mercy's domain. They would sit for hours at the heavy wooden table, watching her work, their eyes wide and curious. The mother never entered the kitchen, considering it a place of filth and labor, and so it became the children's sanctuary. Mercy, who had never known children of her own, found herself in the role of a reluctant surrogate mother. She would tell them stories, not the fairy tales of princes and princesses their mother read to them from leather-bound books, but older, darker stories, tales of the pine barrens, of the spirits that lived in the trees, and the creatures that slept beneath the sandy soil. She taught them the names of the birds and the uses of the wild herbs that grew at the edge of the forest. Her voice, when she spoke of the children, changed. The detached, repertorial tones softened, and for the first time, the officer heard the unmistakable timbre of a deep and complicated grief. She described William as a quiet, watchful boy, with his mother's pale eyes but none of her coldness. He was a child who felt the oppressive weight of his family's legacy and seemed to carry it as a physical burden. Clara was more fragile, a nervous, bird-like girl who startled at loud noises and was prone to fits of weeping that enraged her father. They were, in their own way, prisoners in their own home, as surely as Mercy was. Their shared captivity forged a strange and powerful bond between the enslaved woman and the master's children. They adored her. They followed her everywhere. In a house that demanded silence and stillness, Mercy's presence was the only thing that allowed them to be children. The officer listened, rapt, his ledger forgotten on the table beside him. The story Mercy was telling was creating a powerful counter-narrative to the one she had offered on the porch. The image of two children, so deeply unhappy within the walls of their own home, wandering off into the woods and simply disappearing, began to feel less like a tragic accident and more like an act of desperate escape. He could see the question forming in his own mind, the question that hung in the air between them. Were the children victims of the indifferent woods, or were they victims of the suffocating, cruel world their parents had built? The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the answer. Mercy's narrative continued, her voice a low murmur in the flickering light. She spoke of the war, of the news that trickled into their isolated world, of the father's growing fury and the mother's retreat into a stony, terrified silence. And then, just as she was approaching the time of the children's disappearance, she stopped. The story, which had been flowing with the steady current of long-rehearsed memory, came to an abrupt and jarring halt. The warmth that had entered her voice when speaking of the children vanished, replaced once more by that flat, impenetrable calm. She looked at the officer, her eyes reflecting the lamplight, and repeated the words she had spoken on the porch, as if reciting a line from a script. She said the woods took them. She said that one day they simply walked into the trees and were gone forever. But the performance was flawed. As she spoke these final words, the officer saw it again, the involuntary tremor in her hands. Her fingers, which had been resting loosely on her lap, clenched into tight fists, the knuckles showing white in the dim light. Her gaze, which had been so direct, now slid away from his, fixing on a dark spot on the floorboards just beyond their circle of light. It was a small detail, an anomalous crack in a carefully constructed facade, but to the officer, it was as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. It was the tell of a liar, and a poor one at that. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the story did not end in the woods. It ended here, in this house. His task was no longer simply to record a narrative, but to excavate it. Unconvinced and now deeply disturbed, the census officer's focus shifted. His investigation of the Bellwether property was about to begin in earnest, not with a ledger and a pen, but with a lantern and a growing sense of dread. A disquiet settled upon the census officer after Mercy Hollow retreated for the night, leaving him in the oppressive silence of the grand, shrouded parlor. He was given a small, Spartan room off the main hall, a space that felt colder than the rest of the house, but he knew sleep would be an impossibility. The woman's abrupt halt in her storytelling, the tremor in her hands, the lie that was so transparent in its delivery, had lit a fire of obsessive curiosity within him. It was the same methodical, detail-oriented part of his mind that had once allowed him to track supply lines and troop movements that was now fully engaged in dissecting the inconsistencies of her narrative. He could not rest. The house held a secret, and he felt its presence like a low, subaudible hum that vibrated through the very floorboards beneath his feet. He could not simply wait for morning. The truth, he felt, was a nocturnal creature, one that would only show itself in the deep, watchful hours of the night. He took up the oil lamp she had left him, its small flame a fragile bubble of light against the profound, ink-black darkness, and left his room. He moved back into the parlor, the room of shrouded ghosts. His footsteps, soft as he tried to make them, echoed in the cavernous space. The white sheets covering the furniture seemed to shift and breathe in the flickering light, taking on the forms of recumbent bodies. The eyes of the Bellwether ancestors in their portraits followed him from the walls, their painted expressions seeming to grow more accusatory, more hostile to his presence. He was a trespasser here, not just on private property, but on a sealed and sacred history of sorrow. He began to pace, his path taking him back and forth before the great stone hearth, a cold and lifeless maw that had not seen a fire in years. He was not merely walking, he was thinking, replaying Mercy's words, her tone, her gestures, searching for the key, the single loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire fabrication. It was during his third pass before the fireplace that his boot heel came down on a particular floorboard and produced a sound that was distinctly different from the others. It was not the high-pitched creak of old, dry wood protesting a man's weight. It was a lower, more resonant sound, a hollow report that spoke of an empty space beneath. It was a subtle thing, a detail most would have missed, but to the officer's heightened senses, it was a profound anomaly. He stopped, holding the lamp low. He pressed down on the board again with the toe of his boot. There it was again, a dull, percussive thud. He knelt, the cold of the floor seeping through the fabric of his trousers. He examined the board closely. It was a wide plank of heart pine, like all the others, dark with age and generations of wax and grime. But as he scrutinized its edges, he saw that the accumulated filth was thinner here. The cracks were not as deeply packed with the dust of ages. It was a faint but undeniable sign that this board had been disturbed, that it had been lifted and replaced, and not just once, but perhaps many times over the years. A sense of cold purpose settled over him. This was it. This was the loose thread. He needed a tool, something thin and strong to pry it loose. He thought of his field kit, but retrieved something more personal, more fitting for this grim task. From his satchel, he withdrew the bayonet from his service revolver, a relic of a past he was trying to leave behind. Its polished steel gleamed in the lamplight. He inserted the fine, sharp tip into the hairline crack at the edge of the board. He worked carefully, methodically, leveraging it upwards. The old wood resisted, groaning and splintering. With a final sharp crack, the nails surrendered their long-held grip, and the board popped loose. He set it aside and held the lamp over the opening. The space beneath was not a deep cellar or a crawl space, but the shallow, dusty void between the floor joists, a space filled with cobwebs and the debris of a century. And nestled within that space, resting on the dark, packed earth below, was a small, bundled object wrapped in a piece of discolored oilcloth. His heart beat a heavy, deliberate rhythm against his ribs. His hand, when he reached into the space, was perfectly steady. The oilcloth was cool and slightly waxy to the touch. He lifted the bundle out and placed it on the floor beside the lamp. With careful, almost reverent fingers, he unfolded the stiff, cracked material. Inside were two small objects. The first was a wooden soldier, no taller than his thumb, carved with the charming imprecision of a child's hand. Its uniform had once been painted a bright, cheerful red, but the paint was now faded and chipped, revealing the pale wood beneath. The second object was a small doll, fashioned from a dried corn husk, with hair made of coarse brown yarn that had partially unraveled. They were simple, handmade things, imbued with the unmistakable aura of having been deeply loved. They were children's toys. The officer stared at them, the truth of their location settling upon him with a chilling weight. These were not lost items, accidentally dropped through a crack in the floor. They were treasures, deliberately hidden away, secreted beneath the floorboards in a place of safekeeping. This was a private memorial, a hidden shrine. The question was, why? Why would Mercy Hollow, who claimed the children had been lost to the woods, keep these tokens hidden away, as if they were a guilty secret? This discovery did not sate the officer's curiosity. It sharpened it to a razor's edge. It was the first piece of physical evidence, the first verifiable fact in a house of suffocating lies. His investigation had now moved from the realm of psychological intuition to one of forensic examination. If there was one secret hiding place, there were likely others. He began a systematic search of the room, his movements now driven by a cold, relentless logic. He was no longer a census officer. He was an archaeologist of a recent and terrible past. He ran his hands along the wood-paneled walls, tapping gently, listening for any variation in the sound. He examined the baseboards, the molding around the doors, searching for any sign of a hidden latch or a false panel. He looked for patterns, for breaks in the thick, uniform layer of dust that coated everything. And then he found it. In the center of the room, lying before the cold hearth, was a large, threadbare Persian rug. Its colors were faded to muted shades of rust and indigo, and its edges were frayed. It was an object of no particular note, except for one thing. When he had paced the room earlier, he had noticed that while the floor around it was covered in a fine gray powder of dust, the rug itself was relatively clean, as if it had been moved recently. It was another anomaly, another disruption in the perfect, silent decay of the house. Acting on this intuition, he took hold of one corner of the heavy rug. It was stiff with age. With a great effort that sent clouds of dust billowing into the air, he folded it back upon itself. What lay beneath made the air freeze in his lungs. In the section of floorboards that the rug had concealed, the wood was cleaner, a slightly lighter shade of brown, as if it had been scrubbed or protected from the settling dust. And there, starkly visible in the wood grain, were the unmistakable seams of a large square trapdoor. In its center was a recessed iron ring, flush with the surface of the wood, its dark, rusted metal a stark contrast to the surrounding floor. This was no simple hiding place for toys. This was a significant, structural secret. It was a door that led down, into the foundations of the house, into the earth itself. He looked around the silent, shrouded room, his senses on high alert. He listened for any sound from Mercy, but the house remained as quiet as a crypt. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline of the door. The iron ring was cold, its surface pitted with rust. He slipped his fingers through it and pulled. The door was heavy, swollen tight in its frame by years of humidity and disuse. At first, it would not budge. The officer repositioned himself, planting his feet and using the full strength of his back and legs. He pulled again, a low grunt of exertion escaping his lips. The wood groaned in protest, a long, tortured sound that seemed to fill the entire house. For a moment, he feared the ring would be torn from its setting. Then, with a shuddering crack that echoed like a gunshot, the seal broke. The trapdoor lifted a few inches, releasing a puff of foul, subterranean air. The smell that rose from the darkness below was overpowering. It was not the dry, dusty scent of the parlor, but a thick, wet stench of decay. It was the smell of damp earth, of spreading mildew, and something else, a sickeningly sweet odor of organic putrescence that reminded him of the battlefields of his past. It was the smell of things that had been left to rot in the dark. He propped the heavy door open and held the lantern over the gaping black hole in the floor. A set of steep, narrow stone steps descended into an abyss that the lamp's feeble light could not penetrate. The cold, foul air rose in a steady, chilling draft, a palpable exhalation from the belly of the house. A primal fear, a deep-seated human instinct to shun such places, warned him to stop, to close the door, and leave this house and its secrets behind. But the need to know, the obsessive, rational drive to solve the puzzle, was stronger. He had come this far. He could not turn back now. Holding the lantern high, he began his descent into the hidden cellar. The steps were slick with moisture, and he had to place his feet carefully. The air grew colder and thicker with each step down. The lantern light pushed back the darkness reluctantly, revealing walls of rough-hewn stone that wept with a constant, glistening dampness. The floor of the cellar was made of dark, packed earth. The space was small, no larger than a pantry, and the low ceiling, supported by massive, hand-hewn wooden beams, created a powerful sense of claustrophobia. It felt less like a room and more like a freshly dug grave. At first glance, the cellar appeared to be empty. There were no shelves for preserves, no barrels, no signs of its use as a place of storage. It was a barren, empty stone box. But as his eyes adjusted, as he began to truly see the space, a series of details emerged from the gloom, details that transformed the scene from one of mere decay to one of active, unimaginable horror. He ran his free hand along one of the thick wooden beams that supported the floor above. The wood was damp and slightly soft to the touch, and then his fingers found them. They were scratches. Not the accidental marks of tools or the gnawing of rats. These were deliberate, parallel gouges dug deep into the wood, clustered together at a height of no more than 3 or 4 feet from the floor. They were frantic, desperate marks, the kind of marks a person might make with their fingernails, trying to claw their way out of a trap. A cold dread, colder than the cellar air, began to seep into his bones, a forensic certainty of what had happened here. He moved the lantern along the far wall, its light sliding over the damp, uneven stone. And that is when he saw the carvings, scratched into the soft, porous stone, likely with a shard of rock or a nail, were the crude, unmistakable drawings of a child. There was a large, stick-like figure of a woman, defined by a triangular dress and a severe, unsmiling line for a mouth. And standing on either side of her were 2 much smaller figures, a boy and a girl, their hands connected to hers. It was a child's desperate rendering of their world, a family portrait etched onto the wall of a tomb. The officer stood frozen in the center of the cellar, the lantern shaking in his hand, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the weeping walls. The evidence was all here. The toys, the hidden door, the fingernail scratches, the heartbreaking drawings. The children had never left the house. They had been in this very room. He slowly turned and ascended the stairs, the foul air of the cellar clinging to him like a shroud. He emerged back into the parlor, feeling as if he had surfaced from a great and terrible depth. He left the trapdoor open, a gaping wound in the floor of the house. He did not need to search for Mercy Hollow. She was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, a silhouette against the deeper darkness behind her. She had been watching him. Her face was a mask of shadows, but he could feel the weight of her gaze. He walked to the table where they had spoken earlier and placed the small, carved wooden soldier in the center of the circle of lamplight. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The small, pathetic toy was an accusation, a piece of irrefutable evidence. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing moment. Then, the facade that Mercy Hollow had maintained for so many years, the carefully constructed wall of calm resignation, finally and completely shattered. A tremor ran through her entire body, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. A sound tore itself from her throat, a low, guttural moan of a grief so old and so profound that it seemed to come from the earth itself. Her body sagged, and she collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, and the confession, the real story of what had happened to the Bellwether children, began to spill out of her like a flood. The confession of Mercy Hollow did not begin with a torrent of words, but with the raw, elemental sound of a soul breaking apart. The low moan that had torn itself from her throat deepened into a series of wrenching, tearless sobs that shook her entire gaunt frame. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish, the accumulated grief of years finally breaking through the dam of her stoic silence. The census officer stood motionless, a silent witness to this profound and terrible release. He felt no sense of triumph in his discovery, no satisfaction in having cracked her deception. Instead, he was filled with a deep and unsettling pity. He had approached this mystery as a problem to be solved, a ledger to be balanced, but the human cost of the truth he had uncovered was a weight he had not anticipated. The small parlor, with its shrouded furniture and judgmental portraits, became a confessional, the flickering lamplight casting mercy in a stark, theatrical chiaroscuro of shadow and pale light. When she finally raised her head, her face was a ruin. The mask of stoic resignation had crumbled, revealing the raw, wounded flesh of her grief beneath. Her eyes, which had been so dark and unreadable, were now wide with a remembered horror, reflecting the flame of the lamp like two dark, disturbed pools. She began to speak, her voice no longer the flat, emotionless monotone he had heard before, but a raw, ragged whisper, raspy with unshed tears and the strain of holding a terrible secret for so long. She did not look at the officer, but at the small wooden soldier that sat on the table between them, as if her confession was directed not to him, but to the tiny, inanimate effigy of the child she had failed to save. The story she told was not a simple admission of guilt, but a complex and agonizing account of an act born not of malice, but of a desperate, twisted form of mercy. Her narrative returned to the period just after the war had ended, a time of profound and catastrophic change for the Bellwether household. The South's defeat had not just been a political or military event for Thomas and Evelyn Bellwether. It was a deeply personal apocalypse, a shattering of the very foundations of their world and their identities. The loss of their property, in both land and human form, had undone them. The mother, Evelyn Bellwether, a woman whose entire sense of self had been built upon a fragile scaffolding of lineage and social superiority, had been the first to break. Her refined cruelty, once a weapon she wielded with surgical precision, turned inward. She began to decay from the inside out. Mercy described how the mistress would spend her days wandering the silent, dusty halls of the house, her gloved hands tracing the outlines of the furniture as if trying to reconnect with a world that no longer existed. Her obsession with the past became a full-blown pathology. She started hearing things. At first, it was whispers, faint murmurs that she claimed were coming from the woods. She would stand at the parlor window for hours, staring into the dense, unmoving wall of pines, her head cocked as if listening to a distant conversation. She told her husband that the trees were speaking to her, that they were calling for the children. She claimed the forest was angry, that it demanded a sacrifice for the sins of their ancestors. Her delusion grew more specific, more vivid. She began to speak of a figure in the woods, a pine witch, a malevolent entity that she believed wanted to steal her children away to atone for the Bellwether family's long history of cruelty and land theft. Her mind, Mercy explained, had fractured and was trying to give a name and a face to the formless, existential dread that had consumed her. She became a danger to her own children, her maternal instincts warped into a paranoid, suffocating possessiveness. She would lock them in their rooms for days at a time, to protect them from the whispering woods. While the mother retreated into a world of spectral voices, the father, Thomas Bellwether, descended into a different kind of madness, one fueled by whiskey and impotent rage. A man who had once been the absolute master of his small kingdom was now reduced to a powerless, indebted farmer on a failing piece of land. His violent temper, once a tool of control, now became an unpredictable, explosive force. He began drinking heavily, starting in the morning and continuing late into the night. His rages became more frequent, more terrifying. He would storm through the house, smashing furniture, his voice a bellowing roar of frustration and despair. And his anger, finding no other outlet, began to fixate on the children. They were no longer the proud heirs to his legacy. They were a financial burden, 2 more mouths to feed in a world that had stripped him of his wealth and his pride. The officer listened, his pen still and forgotten, as Mercy described the escalating horror of those final weeks. The house, which had always been a place of coldness and fear, became a living nightmare. The children, William and Clara, were trapped between their mother's delusional paranoia and their father's drunken violence. Mercy became their sole protector, their only shield against the madness that was consuming their parents. She would hide them, she would lie for them, she would absorb the father's rage and the mother's paranoid accusations. She was fighting a losing battle, trying to hold back a tide of insanity that threatened to sweep them all away. The breaking point came during a violent autumn storm. A night, Mercy whispered, when the heavens themselves seemed to be trying to wash the world clean. The wind howled through the pines, a sound that the mother believed was the voice of the Pine Witch, screaming for her children. The rain came down in solid, driving sheets, hammering against the roof and the windows. Inside the house, a storm of a different kind was raging. The father, deeper in his cups than Mercy had ever seen him, had received a letter that day, a final notice of foreclosure from the bank. His ruin was complete. In a drunken, desperate fury, he made a terrible declaration. He had found a way to solve his financial problems. He told his wife that he had made an arrangement with a man from the north, a man who bought and sold indentured servants, a trade that was little more than a thinly veiled continuation of slavery. He was going to sell his own children. He said their pure bellwether bloodline was worth a considerable sum, and their sale would allow him to pay his debts and save the plantation. It was, the officer realized, the ultimate act of a man who had been so thoroughly broken that he was willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to preserve the last, pathetic remnants of his former glory. The mother, hearing this, did not protest. In her fractured mind, selling her children to a stranger was a preferable fate to surrendering them to the whispering woods. She saw it as a form of salvation. She agreed. The deal was to be done in the morning. It was in that moment, listening to the father's drunken pronouncement and seeing the mother's insane, nodding agreement, that Mercy Hollow made her decision. She could not let it happen. She could not stand by and watch those 2 children, the only source of warmth she had ever known in that cold, cruel house, be sold like cattle. She looked at William and Clara, huddled together in a corner of the kitchen, their small faces pale with a terror they could not fully comprehend, and she saw that there was no escape for them. They were trapped. So she devised a plan, an act of desperate, loving intervention. She would not let them be sold, and she would not let their mother's madness claim them. She would hide them. She would protect them. As the storm raged outside, and the parents raged within, Mercy led the 2 children from the kitchen. She told them they were going to play a new game, a hiding game. She led them to the parlor, to the threadbare Persian rug that concealed the trapdoor to the root cellar. She had known of the cellar for years. It was a forgotten space, not used since the house was first built, and she knew the parents never went near it. It was the perfect hiding place. She told the children they had to be very, very quiet. She gave them their favorite toys to comfort them, the small wooden soldier and the cornhusk doll. She promised them she would come back for them as soon as the storm, the one inside the house, had passed. William, ever the watchful and serious one, seemed to understand that this was more than a game. He nodded solemnly. Clara was afraid of the dark, but she trusted Mercy. She took her brother's hand. Mercy opened the heavy door and helped them down the stone steps into the cold, damp darkness. She told them to be brave and that she loved them. Then, with a heavy heart, she closed the trapdoor, slid the rug back into place, and went back to the kitchen to wait. Her plan was to wait until the father had drunk himself into a stupor and the mother had fallen asleep, and then she would retrieve the children and they would run, escape into the woods for real, and never come back. But the storm, the one outside, had other plans. The rain, which had been a steady downpour, intensified into a biblical deluge. It was a storm the likes of which the Pine Barrens had not seen in a generation. The sandy soil, unable to absorb the sheer volume of water, quickly became saturated. Small streams became raging torrents, and the low-lying land on which the bellwether house was built began to flood. Mercy watched in horror as a sheet of dark, murky water began to creep up the porch steps and press against the doors. It seeped through the cracks in the floorboards, creating dark puddles on the parlor floor. And then a horrifying realization dawned on her. The root cellar, it was the lowest point of the house, dug deep into the earth. If the water was getting into the house, it would be pouring into the cellar. A frantic, sickening panic seized her. She ran to the parlor, throwing the heavy rug aside. She pulled at the iron ring of the trapdoor, her fingers slipping on the wet metal. She could hear the water sloshing beneath the floor. When she finally managed to wrench the door open, a great gush of muddy water erupted from the opening, flooding the parlor floor around her. She stared down into the hole, but there was no cellar left to see. It was completely filled with dark, churning water, right up to the very top of the steps. There was no sound. There was no cry for help. There was only the sound of the storm and the steady, lapping sound of the floodwater that had filled her children's tomb. She did not know how long she knelt there, staring into that dark water. Her mind, she said, simply broke. She had tried to save them. She had tried to perform an act of mercy, but in her attempt to protect them from the monsters in their own home, she had delivered them to a different, more indifferent fate. She had locked them in a cellar to protect them, but the storm had come, and it had flooded before she could return. Her act of love had become their grave. The officer sat in the flickering lamplight, the weight of her confession settling upon him like a physical blow. This was the truth. It was a story of such profound and layered tragedy that it defied any simple moral judgment. Was her act one of love or sin? The question was meaningless in the face of such overwhelming horror. He looked at Mercy Hollow, her body still racked with the dry, silent sobs of a grief that could never be exhausted, and he saw a woman who had been living in this house for years, not as a servant, but as the self-appointed keeper of a grave. She had stayed to watch over the children she had tried, and failed, to save. But as he looked at her, at the frantic, haunted look in her eyes, a new, more disturbing thought began to form in his mind. The story felt complete, yet he had the distinct and chilling impression that she was still hiding something, that the horror of that night was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new, and perhaps even more terrible, chapter. He carefully wrote down her words, his own hand shaking slightly, but his mind was already moving past the confession. Her final, whispered words before she fell into a haunted silence were the thing that would keep him awake. She had looked at the floorboards above the now open cellar and whispered that it didn't matter, that the water couldn't hold them. She said they still move beneath the floor. Mercy Hollow's confession hung in the air of the parlor, a story so heavy with sorrow that it seemed to thicken the very atmosphere of the house, making it difficult to breathe. The officer felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the floor beneath him had given way, and he had fallen through into some deeper, darker layer of reality. The rational, orderly world of his census ledgers had been completely annihilated, replaced by a gothic tragedy of such perfect, suffocating despair that it seemed to defy belief. And yet, he did believe it. The evidence of the hidden cellar, the frantic scratches on the beams, the heartbreaking drawings on the wall, all corroborated the essential horror of her tale. The children had not vanished into the woods. They had drowned in a lightless, subterranean tomb, victims of a desperate act of love that had been tragically, cosmically thwarted by a merciless storm. The case, it seemed, was closed. The mystery of the missing Bellwether children had been solved. But as the night deepened, stretching into the small, quiet hours before dawn, a new and even more unsettling layer of the mystery began to reveal itself. Mercy's final, whispered words, the words she had spoken as her confession had trailed off into a haunted, exhausted silence, echoed in the officer's mind. She had said they still moved beneath the floor. At the time, he had dismissed it as the metaphorical rambling of a grief-stricken mind, the poetic expression of a woman so consumed by guilt that she could not accept the finality of death. He assumed she meant their memory, their ghosts, still moved through her thoughts, a constant, restless presence. He was a man of facts and evidence, a man who had seen the grim, undeniable finality of death on a dozen battlefields. He did not believe in ghosts. He had left Mercy slumped in her chair, a vessel emptied of its terrible secret, and had retreated to the small, cold room he had been given. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the oil lamp casting a small, wavering circle of light on the bare floorboards. He tried to process what he had heard, to fit the jagged, horrifying pieces of the story into some kind of coherent, rational framework for the report he knew he must now write. But his thoughts kept snagging on that final irrational detail. They still move. It was an anomalous piece of data, a variable that did not fit the equation of the tragedy he had just solved. The house had fallen into a silence that was even more profound than before. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the charged, watchful silence that follows a terrible revelation. It was in this profound stillness that he heard it. At first, it was so faint that he thought it was a trick of his own overwrought senses, the sound of blood pulsing in his ears. But then he heard it again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a sound coming from the main part of the house. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was a quiet, almost delicate sound, but in the absolute silence of the night, it was as clear and as startling as a scream. He froze, his head cocked, listening. The sound was not coming from the walls, nor from the roof. It was coming from below, from beneath the floorboards. A cold, prickling sensation traced its way up his spine. His rational mind immediately began searching for a logical explanation. It was the house settling, the old wood groaning and contracting in the night air. It was a loose shutter, banging in a phantom breeze. It was a rat, scratching in the crawl space. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate for any of those things. It had a quality of intention to it. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded, he thought with a jolt of pure, unreasoning dread, like a small finger, tapping insistently on the underside of the wood. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he rose from the bed. He was compelled by the same obsessive need for answers that had driven him to pry up the floorboard and descend into the cellar. He took up the lamp, its light seeming to have shrunk, to have grown weaker against the encroaching darkness, and stepped out into the hall. The tapping continued, a steady, patient rhythm in the suffocating quiet. He followed the sound, his bare feet making no noise on the cold floor. It led him back toward the parlor, the scene of the confession. But the sound was not coming from the area around the open trapdoor. It was coming from further down the hall, from the direction of Mercy's own small, private room at the back of the house. As he drew closer, the tapping became more distinct, and it was now joined by another sound, a low, continuous murmur. It was Mercy's voice. She was whispering. He reached the doorway to her room and peered cautiously around the frame. The room was even more Spartan than his own, containing only a simple cot, a small wooden crate that served as a table, and a single, flickering candle that cast long, distorted shadows on the bare plank walls. Mercy Hollow was on the floor. She was on her hands and knees, her back to him, facing the far wall. Her body was canted at an odd angle, her head bent low, as if she were listening to something in the floor. The whispering he had heard was coming from her, a soft, soothing, crooning sound, the kind of sound one might make to comfort a frightened child. And the tapping was coming from directly beneath her. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder here, closer, undeniably real. The officer watched, hidden in the shadows of the doorway, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing and hearing with the known laws of the physical world. He was witnessing a scene of impossible, intimate madness. Mercy was kneeling on the floor, whispering lullabies to the floorboards, and the floorboards were tapping back. Then, he saw her reach out and, with a familiarity born of long practice, slide her fingers into a barely visible crack between two boards. She lifted. A single, short plank of wood came loose in her hands with a soft, sucking sound. She set it aside, revealing a small, dark opening in the floor, no wider than a dinner plate. The tapping stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow more terrifying than the sound it replaced. Mercy leaned over the opening, her whispering becoming more urgent, more pleading. She reached for something on the small crate beside her. It was a small bowl. The officer could see that it contained a portion of the simple meal they had shared earlier, a piece of bread, a few slices of salted pork. She carefully lowered the bowl into the dark opening, holding it there for a moment. What happened next would shatter the officer's carefully constructed reality forever. He saw the bowl dip slightly in her hand, as if a weight had been added to it. Then, she lifted it back up. It was empty. From the shadows of the doorway, he could not see what had taken the food, but he saw the result, the stark, impossible fact of it. Something beneath the floor had taken the offering. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. His mind, the rational, orderly mind of a quartermaster and a census taker, was reeling, unable to process the sensory information it was receiving. This was not grief. This was not madness. This was something else. This was an ongoing relationship, a nightly ritual, a communion between the living and what? He must have made some small, involuntary sound, a sharp intake of breath, a shuffle of his foot, because Mercy's head snapped up. She turned, and in the flickering candlelight, he saw her face. Her expression was not one of fear or surprise. It was an expression of pure, animalistic fury, the protective rage of a mother whose secret nest has been discovered. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, fixed on him, and in that moment, the candle on the crate beside her was extinguished. It did not flicker and die. It went out instantly, as if snuffed by a sudden sharp puff of air, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating blackness. The officer did not remember making a conscious decision to run. His body simply reacted, his soldier's instincts taking over, screaming at him to flee from a danger his mind could not begin to comprehend. He scrambled backward, stumbling through the dark hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for the main door, his hands slick with a cold sweat. He did not dare to look back. He could feel her presence behind him in the darkness, not moving, but watching, and he could hear a new sound, a sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. It was a faint, dry, whispering sound from beneath the floorboards, the sound of something small and light scurrying through the dark, enclosed space under the house. He burst out of the front door and into the pre-dawn chill, gasping for air as if he had been holding his breath for an eternity. The sky to the east was just beginning to pale into a bruised, grayish purple. The air had never tasted so clean, so real. He did not stop to saddle his horse. He simply untied it and threw himself onto its bare back, kicking its flanks and sending it galloping away from the house, away from the encroaching pines, away from the unspeakable secret that it held. He rode like a man possessed, fleeing not from a person, but from a place, from a truth that was so profoundly wrong that it threatened to unravel his own sanity. As he reached the edge of the overgrown clearing, just before the forest swallowed the track completely, he could not stop himself. He risked a single, fleeting glance back at the house. It stood silent and dark against the lightening sky, a black, skeletal silhouette, and in one of the upper windows, the window of what must have been the children's bedroom, he saw it, or he thought he saw it. It was a flicker of movement in the darkness. Two small, pale faces, side by side, peering out from the black void of the window frame. They were just watching him go. He dug his heels into his horse's sides and rode harder, fleeing the dawn, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Bellwether property before the sun rose on what he now knew to be a place of unimaginable and perhaps eternal horror. The question was no longer what had happened to the children. The question, the one that burned in his mind as he fled, was what had they become. The census officer rode for hours, his flight a blind, frantic gallop that paid no heed to the winding, treacherous paths of the pine barrens. The oppressive canopy of the forest, which had seemed so menacing on his journey in, now felt like a welcome shield, a green and tangled buffer between himself and the waking nightmare he had left behind. He did not slow his pace until the sun was high in the sky and the dense woods finally began to thin, giving way to the familiar, comforting sight of cleared farmland and the distant spire of a church. He had escaped the Bellwether property, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like a deep, incurable chill, that the house and its secrets would never truly leave him. The experience had fractured something within him, cracking the very foundations of his rational, orderly view of the world. He had looked into an abyss, and the abyss had shown him a truth for which his ledgers and his logic had no columns. He found lodging at a small, roadside inn several towns away, a place of comforting anonymity where no one knew his name or the reason for the haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes. He spent the next 3 days in his rented room, a self-imposed quarantine against the contagion of the memory. He did not speak to anyone. He barely ate. His sole focus was the official report he was required to file. It was his duty, the final act of his assignment, and he clung to it as a drowning man clings to a piece of wreckage. He thought that by committing the events to paper, by translating the ineffable horror into the neat, structured language of a government document, he might be able to contain it, to master it, to reduce it to a simple, manageable case file. He was wrong. He sat for hours at a small wooden desk, a stack of fresh paper and a pot of ink before him, but the words would not come. How could he report what he had seen? He began by trying to stick to the facts, to the verifiable evidence. He wrote of his arrival at the dilapidated farmhouse, his interview with the sole occupant, Mercy Hollow. He described the initial story of the children vanishing into the woods. He documented his discovery of the hidden toys, the trapdoor, the cellar with its desperate, clawed markings on the beams. This part was straightforward, a linear, evidentiary trail that would satisfy any magistrate or superior officer. It was a tragic, but entirely terrestrial, story of neglect, abuse, and a probable, undocumented death. He could have ended the report there, filed it, and closed the case. The official record would have noted that the Bellwether children had likely perished in the house, and their bodies were concealed by the servant. It would have been a neat, tidy, and utterly incomplete version of the truth. But he could not stop there. His duty as a man of facts compelled him to account for everything. And so, he attempted to write about the second night. He tried to describe the rhythmic tapping that had drawn him from his room. He tried to explain the sight of Mercy Hollow kneeling on the floor, whispering to the boards, and the impossible moment when the food she offered into the darkness was taken by some unseen thing. His hand began to shake, the nib of his pen scratching and spattering ink across the page. The neat, precise penmanship that had been the pride of his quartermaster days devolved into a frantic, barely legible scrawl. The words he wrote seemed insane, the ravings of a fevered mind. He wrote of a candle extinguished by an unseen breath, of the dry, rustling sound of movement beneath the floors, of the two small, pale faces he had seen watching him from the upstairs window as he fled. He wrote and rewrote the final section a dozen times, each draft more frantic, more unhinged than the last. He crossed out entire paragraphs with thick, angry strokes of ink, as if he could physically obliterate the memory itself. He realized the futility of his task. There was no bureaucratic language, no official terminology that could contain the truth of what he had witnessed. To report what he had actually seen would be to invite ridicule, to risk his career and his reputation. They would call him mad, a man broken by the lingering traumas of war, a man who had succumbed to the superstitious folklore of the backwoods. He was trapped. He could file a lie, a sanitized and incomplete report that would close the case but betray the truth. Or he could file the truth and be branded a lunatic. In the end, he did neither. On the fourth day, he took all his frantic, ink-stained drafts, all his attempts to explain the inexplicable, and he burned them. He watched in the small hearth of his room as the pages curled and blackened, the words of horror turning to gray, weightless ash. He then took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote his final, official report. It was a model of brevity and bureaucratic efficiency. He noted the location of the Bellwether property. He recorded the deaths of Thomas and Evelyn Bellwether, as reported by their former servant. And in the space reserved for the children, William and Clara, he wrote the same simple, elegant lie that had been told for years. The lie the world was prepared to believe. He wrote, "Missing, presumed lost to the woods." He had looked into the abyss, and he had chosen to pull the curtain closed. Some truths, he now understood, were not meant for the official record. Some case files were meant to be sealed forever. He left the town the next morning and never returned to the Pine Barrens again. He completed his census duties in other, less haunted corners of the state and eventually returned to his home in the north, to a world of cobblestone streets and predictable, rational commerce. He tried to forget. But the memory of that house, of the tapping beneath the floor, of the faces in the window, became a permanent part of his internal landscape, a secret, lightless cellar in the architecture of his own mind. Years later, driven by a morbid curiosity he could no longer suppress, he made some discreet inquiries through old government channels. He learned what had become of the Bellwether property. According to a local sheriff's report filed about a year after his own visit, a hunter passing through the area had discovered the farmhouse burned to the ground. The fire had been intensely hot, consuming the old, dry wood of the structure and leaving behind little more than a blackened foundation and a solitary stone chimney, standing like a tombstone against the sky. Investigators had sifted through the ashes and had found a single set of human remains, charred beyond recognition, but presumed to be those of the woman known as Mercy Hollow. There was no mention of any other bodies. The official cause of the fire was listed as accidental, likely a stray spark from the hearth or a misplaced candle. But the officer knew better. He knew it had not been an accident. He pictured Mercy, alone in that house with her terrible secret and her even more terrible companions. He saw her final act not as one of carelessness, but as one of ultimate, desperate mercy. A fire to cleanse the house, to purify the land, to release the small, restless spirits that she had cared for, that she had fed, that she had kept company with in the long, dark years of her penance. Or perhaps, he thought with a final, chilling shudder, it was not Mercy who had started the fire at all. The Bellwether property was officially declared abandoned, and the forest, which had been patiently waiting at its edges for decades, finally moved in to reclaim its own. The vines and thorny brambles grew over the charred foundation, and the relentless pitch pines seated themselves in the ash-rich soil. Within a generation, all visible trace of the house, of the family, of the terrible secret buried beneath its floorboards, was gone, swallowed by the silent, indifferent wilderness. The local legends of the Pine Barrens absorbed the story, as they absorbed all such tragedies, stripping it of its specific horror and turning it into a vague, cautionary tale told to frighten children. They spoke of a strange, reclusive woman who had lived in a haunted house, and of two lost children whose ghosts could sometimes be heard laughing on the wind on cold autumn nights. And the official record, the great, fractured mosaic of history, remained silent. To this day, if one were to look in the meticulously kept archives of the United States Census of 1870, one would find the entry for the Bellwether family of New Jersey. And beside the names of William and Clara, there would be the same two words, written in the neat, precise hand of a forgotten census officer: presumed lost. History had chosen to believe the Woods, because the alternative, the truth of what was really buried in that house, was simply too terrible to remember. The forest, in the end, swallows all stories, but it is the ones that are too cruel to be retold that it digests most completely, returning them to the soil, where they wait, in the darkness, for the right questions to be asked again. The case file on Mercy Hollow is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.